I'd like to talk today about the refugee crisis that is currently happening in the world, especially around Europe and the Middle East. Now, I'd like to talk about this primarily in relation to human rights because over the last few years I've been drawn to the idea and the fact that the West is incredibly hypocritical in its nature to actually promoting human rights. I mean, the fact that human rights is a Western concept should not be covered on this topic, but I will mention it now briefly because it just has to be known that, yes, the West is were the primary drivers behind the current unilateral Declaration of Human Rights, universal even. Now, in terms of the refugee crisis, I personally believe that the way that states are acting is, for the most part, horrific. I mean, there is international law put in place specifically for refugees, and it seems bizarre for this to just be ignored when it suits a state. Of course, it reifies the Weberian idea of a world of nations, and the fact that NGOs and international organisations are little other than pests to the big nation state. But even still, so Article 13.1 has and Article 14.1 are basically put forward in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to cover asylum seekers and those who are escaping from persecution or prosecution in a different country, and definitely civil war. Now, the fact that this is written down and this is what the US and the UK and the rest of the EU countries this is what they actively promote through the European Court of Human Rights, and the way that basically human rights are used to justify military intervention. So one of the reasons we went to the Middle East is to spread the democratic principles, which are they're covered in the way the Human Rights Act, the Human Rights Declaration has been written. So essentially, the four articles which cover refugees specifically are Articles 1, 13, 14, and 22. Well, they are definitely applicable to this refugee crisis. Now, it's horrific, essentially, what some EU member states are doing, specifically Hungary and the other countries closest to the border where the refugees are coming in from. But it seems as if that, despite 4 out of the, 30 articles within the Declaration of Human Rights that covering it, it seems that they're just ignored as a outspoken minority. And of course, the UK is depressingly following suit, as is a lot of the countries of the European Union, US especially. Other than Germany, it seems, who deserves specific praise in this topic. It would appear that the Western states do seem to be incredibly hypocritical in how they are promoting these human rights, because a glaring example is the West, and especially the EU's attitude to how the Middle Eastern countries, so the Saudi Arabia, for example, how they have taken in 0 refugees and only provided financial support. So there is a I don't know, it's definitely a blame game and a delegation of this, of essentially nobody really wants to openly flaunt these quite old and cherished articles of international law, but it's happening nonetheless through the medium of blame, essentially. Now, Article 14 specifically says that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from protection. That's Article 14.1. Now, that means that if you are under persecution and you are seeking asylum, the countries are bound to take you in. It's not like migration, which has been conflated with the refugee crisis all too often. The fact that it's been called the migrant crisis through the media is, to be honest, abominable. There's no reason why people should try and conflate the two subjects of debate, because both have strong underlying features. Now, it's also how the EU has been dealing with this crisis is further to be blamed and condemned, because there's been a recent EU report which has basically listed out several countries being safe and other countries being not safe. Now, the European Union's safe countries include Bosnia, Albania, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and several others, Turkey not included. But this seems to directly contravene Articles 2 and 9 of the Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this is because these articles cover non-discrimination on nationality, so from which country you're coming from, and rules shouldn't be imposed arbitrarily which deal with nationality. So this seems to go against everything that's been promoted by the Declaration of Human Rights for the sake of economic arguments. That is something that is really has been bugging me a lot, because by conflating refugees to migrants, there's a growing narrative of people trying to steal social provisions such as health and education and crowding, and the list goes on essentially from the right. And it just seems as if they're using this there's a greater debate about immigration and the movement of people in general, but the fact that the right is so easily mixing the two is to be condemned. Now, something that else has really been annoying me in this sort of issue of being hypocritical when promoting human rights abroad is the terrorism narrative, and that those who are deemed as terrorist or have connections to terrorist organizations should be given less than democratic or less than just treatment, for they are denied the right to liberty through the UK is a prime example. They, in the 2000 Terrorism Act, they allowed detention without trial for terrorist suspects, which was since nullified in the case of A and others v Secretary of State for the Home Department in 2004. Now, that contravenes Article 3, which everyone knows is the right to life, liberty and security of person. And that's, without a doubt, blamed completely on the fact that by labelling someone as a terrorist, you can deny them these rights. And you can deny them Article 6 as well, because they don't need to be recognised as somebody equal in part of the law, because it's essentially they have to be proven innocent, which goes against innocent unless proven guilty, the doctrine. And Articles 10, 12 and 5 also cover the fact that, people should be treated like humans, which for many seems to be a bizarre concept, but it's as if being pronounced a terrorist with very little evidence means that you should be denied human rights. Seems to me bizarre. Anyway, so as well as the UK being hypocritical in trying to promote these aims abroad whilst contravening them, the US famously has had Guantanamo Bay. Now, Guantanamo Bay has been they've tried to bring it down so many times. There's a pressure group within the US which is specifically takes on this issue about Guantanamo Bay. I mean, even Obama, when he came into office, the first thing he said he would do is close down Guantanamo Bay, and failed monumentally. And so the fact that it seems bizarre for the US to be declaring wars in the name of human rights for this odd purpose. And furthermore, like the death penalty being still around in 32 out of the 50 states of America is also worth noting as they go abroad. Because what that does is it not only is hypocritical, but it furthers the hypocrisy of other Western states who genuinely do try to promote the abolition of the death penalty worldwide. For example, in the EU, the ECHR forbids it, and therefore working in operations with the US at any time abroad means that we are subtly advocating it almost, because it seems that as long as you're our close allies, human rights need not apply. But talking about the ECHR is also interesting because it is a very good proponent of human rights within the EU, which is lessening this hypocrisy and making genuine efforts of people who want to promote human rights in general, which is a good thing. And it seems as if side note, the ACP, African Union, essentially, they use their own Court of Human Rights in order to promote human rights within their area, but they can also use judgments from the ECHR to back up their evidence in their courts. So it should, in the long term, prove to be that having regional human rights courts will hopefully lessen the state of this hypocrisy that the West has been very aptly accused of. I mean, as well as this, we have military endeavours, or the way that the West. I mean, I'll talk about the US and the UK, but by far they're not the only ones who should be mentioned. They, for example, are so guilty of having a hypocritical stance when promoting human rights, especially with the use of their armed forces, because they had in their tortures within, they were torturing Afghanistanis, and Iraqis as well during their invasions. So Baha Musa died and was killed by essentially the UK. It's not, through torture, which was condemned quite rightly. And the fact that the US, although they refused to sign up to the Geneva Protocols 1 and 2, which states that you should only attack someone if they've been absolutely confirmed as a non-civilian, which, if you've heard anything about military operations in the past 30 years, you'll understand that the US's promotion of human rights is actively undermined by this lack of, essentially, they don't have the evidence, and they will essentially shoot first and think later. Now, that's just my brief rant, being very broad and covering quite a lot of things in a short amount of time. It's essentially me just thinking out loud. But I want to think about some theoretical positions that can be explored in relation to this debate. Now, speaking about the terrorism narrative, I've personally thought about the idea of securitization for a long time. The idea that some political actor decides that an issue is so of such importance that it requires non-democratic means of solving it. There are countless examples of how there's issues have been conflated to be securitized. The US famously did it with the environment, and immigration's been securitized for such a long time. To bring us back to this argument that securitization brings with it a certain amount of tools. Now, there's two schools which are at loggerheads with each other over this issue. So there's the Welsh school and there's the Copenhagen school. Now, Welsh school argue for securitizing everything because that brings resources to it, whilst the Copenhagen school argues for getting rid of that because it prioritizes some over others. Now, the fact that terrorism for a long time has been securitized to such an extent that it overrides any other discussion in the area. So the fact that people can, and often do, mention terrorist activities in relation to the refugee crisis it's quite worrying, because the instruments and resources given to solving a securitized issue are very often military based. For example, the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis there was a council meeting discussing solutions. They eventually came up with the idea of having this project called EU NAV4, which was a military mission in the Mediterranean, which would focus on blowing up the boats of refugees in order to stop them. Now, they had several options. They could either abide by international law and take everyone and process them. They could stop the boats and ask them to turn around, or see what sort of condition they are, inspect the boats and deal with them accordingly, or they could just blow them up. Now, it being refugee crisis being a securitized issue and seen as a threat to our national being is easily, they chose the military option, which is unsurprising considering the securitization of it. Now, as well as this, in the background, there is the constant reinforcement of the failed state thesis. Now, that's the idea that some states are good at being states, and others, predominantly African and Asian countries, are considered failed in some way or another. They are critiqued against each other. They're essentially critiqued against the Bavarian Western state model, and because they don't live up to this Bavarian Western state paradigm, they are subjected to being lesser, and they are essentially alienated from talks, and the populace are very much turned against them. And underlining that is the idea that it's further reifying Orientalism, so the idea of differences in cultures, and that we should treat other people as being mysterious if they don't come from elsewhere other than Europe and North America. And so it's obviously Said's argument was that the West actually refuses to experience the East for themselves, and they refuse to acknowledge them as being normal in terms of the Bavarian state ideal. But this is reinforced so thoroughly through this refugee crisis narrative that we being the West, have to deal with these refugees because the other states have failed in being states. Now, as an alternative way to view them, but being critical, we need to be aware of how easily that phrase is used and accepted by the general populace. But overall, going through a post-structuralist lens, it seems that this entire argument, the human rights in general, the refugee crisis, everything within this is reinforcing the sovereign state meta-narrative in general, whereby we are constantly classified. The fact that the EU has turned into this, it's gained a culture of us v them that's only really seen in war zones, or like the Cold War was especially prominent. It's a very old way of thinking, essentially, to say that we have to look after ourselves, and those people, no matter who they are others, and which should be condemned because they're not from the same bit of land we were originally born on. And that, I mean, even the human rights in general aren't flawless. I mean, they do specifically state out that in Article 15 that everyone has the right to nationality, and you shouldn't be denied your nationality. And so it really focuses on how the world is full of states. Admittedly, the declaration is quite a few years old. It's fairly outdated now in terms of thinking, but for its time its focus on women's rights issues was, to be honest, a groundbreaking phenomenon. But even still, the failed state thesis was so easily the fact that all of this is continuing to be prevalent through the debate. So, as I say, the safe countries set out in the EU report highlights both the failed state thesis and reinforcing the sovereign method narrative. And it's this sort of critical stance, I believe, is necessary for this crisis, for us to not sink back into how it's critical, because it's crucial to be used, because otherwise we are essentially self-reifying the sovereign state in our own minds. And to be honest, The fact, if you look through a critical lens, you'll see the right wing are against immigrants because they are different, but the left wing are being equally as destructive because they are still reifying this us and them by saying they need to come here. It's a weird way of conceptualizing it, but it's interesting to see that refugees are always categorized through local and national resources as being others to us. Now, if you've made it this far, thank you very much for listening. It's just essentially me babbling on about the Human Rights Act and my opinions of this, of the hypocrisy that's been prevalent in recent years. But thank you for listening.